Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. If February is a month for budget declaration and discussion time in India, then January is certainly the month of budget formulation and finalization. The finance minister is reported to have completed her deliberations with all budget stakeholders and has heard them out, perhaps rejecting most of the suggestions put to her by interested lobbies with vested interests. Since the budget is influenced by the prevailing state of the economy and by the financial position of the government at present, their data and numbers, which is numbers about the state of the economy and the financial position of the government, need to be carefully considered. However, since the actual performance of the Indian economy during the current financial year ending on 31st March 22 will be known only much later, at the earliest only by April 22, the government needs to do its budget finalization with the help of estimates. The CSO has recently released the first set of advanced estimates about the economy and about the state of government finances, and these numbers merit a close look in order to pinpoint the undercurrents and compulsions of the economy and the state of the government finances in its budget formulation. So what are the key estimates that the CSO has recently released? The first advanced estimates about the economy and the government finances, as per the CSO, are something like this. The CSO says that India's real economy is expected to grow at 9.2% during the current financial year, aided by the low base effect of a contraction of 7.3%, which was recorded last year. The Reserve Bank estimate of such GDP growth, however, remains at 9.5%. But as the Omicron wave intensifies, it too is likely to prune its estimates to a much more realistic figure of what the GDP growth will be during the current financial year. At a growth rate of 9.2%, India will regain the tag of being the fastest growing large economy in the world, particularly exceeding the growth rate of China. This estimated growth rate of 9.2% means that India's GDP for financial year 2022 will exceed the comparative pre-pandemic GDP for financial year 2020 by 1.3%. India's economy at the end of March 22 will just about surpass the pre-pandemic GDP, implying 2 years of lost growth for the country, which is financial year 21 as well as financial year 22. The CSO then says that the nominal GDP growth rate is expected to be much higher at 17.6% because of the tailwinds of a double-digit WPI and a rising consumer price inflation index. It is the rising prices that have hugely inflated India's GDP in its nominal count, and we should not be impressed by it. Further, the increase in the normal GDP has therefore pumped up tax collections, both direct and indirect, which are now expected to surpass the budget estimates by about 2 lakh crore rupees. The CSO then says that the government will be able to attain its fiscal deficit target of 6.8% of GDP as was projected by it in the budget last year, despite not meeting its disinvestment and privatization collection targets, which actually now hinge on the sale of BPCL and the LIC IPO, both of which are taking time. Some experts feel that the fiscal deficit during the current year could be lower at 6.5%, showing a significant improvement in the state of government finances. This betterment of the fiscal deficit is inferred from the fact that fiscal deficit as at November 2021, as reported by the CSO, was a mere 46% of the budget estimates, as against a figure of 135% of the budget estimates at the same time in the last year. It finally says that India's GDP is thus expected to be at rupees 232 lakh crores for the financial year 22, as against rupees 197.5 lakh crores last year and rupees 203.5 lakh crores for the financial year 2020. With this growth, India's per capita income will cross 1,50,000 per person in the financial year 21-22, as against rupees 1,29,000 last year and rupees 1,34,000 in the financial year 2009-20. The sector-wise growth estimates as per the CSO are that riding a good monsoon, agriculture will grow by 3.9%, manufacturing by 12.5%, construction by 10.7%, and the services sector will record a muted growth rate of 8.2% during the current financial year. Private consumption spending grew by just 6.9% and government spending did so by 7.6%, which in real terms to us is a negative growth if inflation is factored in. The CSO then says that the government debt will balloon to 90% of GDP by 31st March 22, as against 70% of GDP during the pre-pandemic period, both of which are much more than the desirable figure of 60% of GDP for a comparable economy. With such a jump in debt, interest payments by the government will increase by 1 lakh crore per annum, with interest as an expenditure being almost 41% of government receipts, which is a very high figure. So what is the correlation between these CSO estimates, the economy, and the forthcoming budget? To us, such estimates have a direct connect with the ground realities of the economy and are worthy of consideration in the budget formulation. The first implication is that the estimate of a GDP growth of 9.2% for the financial year 2022 is chiefly based on the GDP growth of 13.7%, which was recorded during the first half of the current financial year ending 30th September 21. According to us, there is a sizable element of estimation and extrapolation in this figure, and it could go down to as low as 8.5% as per some experts, all depending on how Omicron plays out. Oxford Economics estimates it at a mere 7.6% as per its latest estimates. These estimates can go haywire, and that too mostly downwards because of the ongoing Omicron wave, which is yet to peak and which is causing disruptions during the quarter 4, which is generally considered to be the busiest and the most productive quarter of the economy in any financial year. Further, with already over 40% of government receipts being earmarked for interest payments, India's GDP and government revenue need to rise much faster, or else the government debt will become unsustainable and it will weaken government finances even further. We would further infer that the tax collections have shot up in the current financial year mainly because of the low base effect and the rising nominal GDP on account of the elevated inflation. The reality is that as a percentage of GDP, tax collections have fallen to 9.9% from the not so healthy but higher figure of 10.2% during the pre-pandemic period. It means that the government is not earning enough money to ramp up much needed expenditure on health, education, infrastructure and defense. This to us is a major weakness in government finances and needs to be looked into very seriously. Further, due to weak consumer sentiment and confidence, mainly because of joblessness and loss of livelihood, the share of private spending in the overall GDP has fallen from 55.6% in financial year 2020 to 52.7% now. This trend will only further delay the resumption of private investment in new projects so badly needed by the economy. It can further be seen that the weak private consumption and frail consumer sentiment, due to which private spending is 2.9% below the pre-pandemic levels, is reflected in negative growth in sectors like travel, tourism, transport, hospitality, and other contact-intensive sectors, and these will particularly need fiscal support from the government. It is seen that there has been an increase in demand for Manrega jobs. There is a weak demand for motorcycles and now for tractors too, and rural wages have become flat, all of which go to show an erosion of growth imperatives in the rural sector too as compared to what it was earlier. We also see that even at 9.2%, the growth is not broad-based or across the board. So while sectors like manufacturing and construction are expected to log a double-digit growth, those like trade, hotels, tourism, etc. are still lagging behind even their pre-COVID levels, and they certainly need urgent attention. The expected pickup in private investment is not taking off, and the government will need to pick up the tab and ramp up its own capital expenditure. With the MPC expected to normalize monetary policy and increase the interest rates from April 2022, it is the fiscal policy support that will have to kick in order to support economic growth in the country. Interest rates will go up, that is anti-growth, and fiscal support will need to come in to compensate for that. So what are the implications of these estimates for the forthcoming budget? The imperatives in fiscal and economic management and policy on the basis of these estimates, which will have to be reflected in the coming budget proposals, are something as follows. The first one, the government debt is too high and we will need to push up the GDP growth in order to dilute the effects of excess borrowings on the state of government finances, which limit the amount of expenditure it can incur. The second, the government will need to provide fiscal support as the support of monetary policy peters out of the economy starting April in particular. That is going to be reflected, or rather should be reflected in the budget somewhere. Further, the recovery remains uncertain and patchy and it needs extra fiscal attention. The real problem lies in consumer spending, which is also holding back the fresh investments in the country. The solution for it lies in more jobs and better ease of doing business to facilitate livelihood in the country. We would expect the budget to consider that. Inflation needs to be tamed, or else it will further depress consumer spending, which will only further erode growth in the country. And finally, the fiscal deficit control and reduction at such times is not the best policy of the government. By not spending, the government is sacrificing overall growth of the nation, which should be the top priority for the Indian economy at the moment. We know for sure that there are numerous state elections on the cards. While these are the imperatives for the budget based on what we think rational, prudent thinking, but very soon political considerations always take over the economy. So while we would say that these estimates and their implications must be considered in the budget, very often that is not the case, and it might be this time also. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.